Today we're going to be discussing A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. So this book follows a young boy by the name of Stephen Dedalus into his development as a young man. In this semi-autobiographical Bildungsroman novel, we see Stephen explore life through all different lenses, such as art, politics, religion, and familial expectations, and it takes place in late 19th, early 20th century Ireland. So Joyce uses many different elements, but especially symbolism and imagery, to illustrate Stephen's struggle between societal expectations and his desire for freedom, ultimately suggesting that self-discovery comes from rejecting conformity and defying social and religious constraints. God and religion before everything, Dante cried. God and religion before the world. Mr. Casey raised his clenched fist and brought it down on the table with a crash. Very well then, he shouted hoarsely. If it comes to that, no God for Ireland. John! John! Cried Mr. Dedalus, seizing his guest by the coat sleeve. Dante stared across the table, her cheeks shaking. Mr. Casey struggled up from his chair and bent across the table towards her, scraping the air from before his eyes with one hand as though he were tearing aside a cobweb. No God for Ireland, he cried. We have had too much God in Ireland. Away with God. Blasphemer, devil, screamed Dante, starting to her feet and almost spitting in his face. Uncle Charles and Mr. Dedalus pulled Mr. Casey back into his chair again, talking to him from both sides reasonably. He stared before him out of his dark flaming eyes, repeating, Away with God, I say. Dante shoved her chair violently aside and left the table, upsetting her napkin ring, which rolled slowly along the carpet and came to rest against the feet of an easy chair. Mrs. Dedalus rose quickly and followed her towards the door. At the door, Dante turned round violently and shouted down the room, her cheeks flushed and quivering with rage. Devil out of hell, we won. We crushed him to death. Fiend. The door slammed behind her. Mr. Casey, freeing his arms from his holders, suddenly bowed his head on his hands with a sob of pain. Poor Parnell, he cried loudly, my dead king. He sobbed loudly and bitterly. Stephen, raising his terror-stricken face, saw that his father's eyes were full of tears. So this first passage comes from the first chapter of the book, and it's extremely important in just setting the stage of things and providing context for later events. So it shows the turmoil that exists in Stephen's family due to religion and politics. So just for some extra context, Dante is very religious. Mr. Casey, the other character in this argument, not as religious. And because of their differences in those point of views, they also have different point of views in politics. So there's this one particular politician from Ireland at the time, Charles Parnell, who caused a lot of controversy because he was involved in a cheating scandal. So Dante strongly dislikes him because of this affair, because she's very Christian, versus Mr. Casey, has a lot of nationalist beliefs, so he prefers to stand by Parnell. And because of those decisions, it leads to a very heated debate within the family, and it makes Stephen really uncomfortable as a kid. And I decided to include this passage because even though it's not necessarily about his beliefs as he grows up, it shows what he was surrounded by, and it shows what he had to turn away from. His family was so set on religion and politics, and it was such a big concept for them, and he decided just to turn around on everything and later leave Ireland and abandon the Catholic faith. And then 2 points from 2 of the critics here. Carl Nusgaard of the New York Times, he writes, We are born into a family, and by virtue of how it receives and relates to us, we become manifest to ourselves and to others. We learn a language, and though it does not belong to us alone, but is shared by all members of the community, it is by means of our language that we understand and express ourselves, and that which is all around us. With the language comes a culture of which, whether we like it or not, we become a part. So essentially, he's saying that we are who we are because of how we're raised, regardless of we accept that or we decide to rebel against it because we don't like what we were surrounded by as we were growing up. And then another point from one of the other critics, Colm Toibin of The Guardian, he writes, The Christmas dinner scene with the bitter argument about Parnell between Stephen's father and his aunt could easily have come from many Irish tables in the 1970s and 80s as families rode over what was happening in Northern Ireland. So again, this also just shows how relevant this particular politician and this issue was at the time. So much so that conversations carried over a century later in the 70s and 80s, our 1970s and 1980s. So again, just shows that not only is it like really important to the book as a whole and understanding things in terms of context, but it's also realistic, and it was based on things that were real life conversations and real life issues. As soon as the boys had turned into Clonliffe Road together, they began to speak about books and writers, saying what books they were reading and how many books there were in their father's bookcases at home. Stephen listened to them in some wonderment, for Bolin was the dunce and Nash the idler of the class. In fact, after some talk about their favorite writers, Nash declared for Captain Marryat, who he said was the greatest writer. Fudge, said Heron, asked Daedalus. Who was the greatest writer, Daedalus? Stephen noted the mockery in the question and said, Of prose, do you mean? Yes. Newman, I think. Is it Cardinal Newman? Asked Boland. Yes, answered Stephen. The grin broadened on Nash's freckled face as he turned to Stephen and said, And do you like Cardinal Newman, Daedalus? Oh, many say that Newman has the best prose style, Heron said to the other two in explanation. Of course he's not a poet. And who was the best poet, Heron? Asked Boland. Lord Tennyson, of course, answered Heron. Oh, yes, Lord Tennyson, said Nash. We have all of his poetry at home in a book. At this, Stephen forgot the silent vows he had been making and burst out. Tennyson a poet? Why, he's only a rhymester. Oh, get out, said Heron. Everyone knows that Tennyson is the greatest poet. And who do you think is the greatest poet? Asked Boland, nudging his neighbor. Byron, of course, answered Stephen. Heron gave the lead, and all three joined in a scornful laugh. What are you laughing at? Asked Stephen. You, said Heron. Byron is the greatest poet. He's only a poet for uneducated people. He must be a fine poet, said Boland. You may keep your mouth shut, said Stephen, turning on him boldly. All you know about poetry is what you wrote up on the slates in the yard and were going to be sent to the loft for. Boland, in fact, was said to have written on the slates in the yard a couplet about a classmate of his who often rode home from the college on a pony. The thrust put the two lieutenants to silence, but Heron went on. In any case, Byron was a heretic and immortal too. I don't care what he was, cried Stephen hotly. You don't care whether he was a heretic or not, said Nash. What do you know about it, shouted Stephen. You never read a line of anything in your life except the Trans or Boland either. I know that Byron was a bad man, said Boland. Here, catch hold of this heretic, Heron called out. In a moment, Stephen was a prisoner. Tate made you buck up the other day, Heron went on, about the heresy in your essay. I'll tell him tomorrow, said Boland. Will you? Said Stephen. You'd be afraid to open your lips. Afraid? Aye, afraid of your life. Behave yourself, cried Heron, cutting at Stephen's legs with his cane. It was a signal for their onset. Nash pinioned his arms behind, while Boland seized a long cabbage stump which was lying in the gutter. Struggling and kicking under the cuts of the cane and the blows of the knotty stump, Stephen was borne back against a barbed wire fence. Admit that Byron was no good. No. Admit. No. Admit. No. No. So, Passage 2, which comes from the second chapter of the book, is a really prime example of Stephen demonstrating his love for art. So, as I read, he was beaten by his so-called peers for his opinion. And he greatly prefers Lord Byron's work as a poet over Lord Tennyson's, and he doesn't succumb to the pressure from those around him. He was extremely passionate, not only about his preference for poets, but just about art in general. And when he's questioned about it, he asks Heron, what do you know about it? You've never read a line of anything in your life. So that sentence alone just shows how seriously he takes art and how passionate he really is. And it also foreshadows his later determination to stand by art, even when things get tough. He's presented with a certainty of employment by choosing the option of going to the priesthood later on in the novel, but he decides to stick with art anyway because he wants creative freedom. And then to bring Toybin back into the conversation, he writes that essentially all the stuff that happened within this scene could have happened when he was a student in university. The fierce debate among young men about poetry and art, the sexuality in the air, fervent and repressed all at the time, and the need to make urgent plans as a way of winning the argument to leave Ireland altogether belonged to the city I knew as much to the city of Joyce's book. So again, just showing that what Joyce wrote was still relevant well throughout the 20th century, let alone late 19th and the earlier part of the 1900s. It maintained relevancy throughout this whole period of time. And it just goes to show that this theme of, having different debates about what's going on around us and being able to choose what you're really passionate about, that's something that has longevity and sticks throughout generations. He was passing at that moment before the Jesuit house in Gardemer Street and wondered vaguely which window would be his if he ever joined the order. Then he wondered at the vagueness of his wonder, at the remoteness of his own soul from what he had hitherto imagined her sanctuary, at the frail hold which so many years of order and obedience had of him, when once a definite and irrevocable act of his threatened to end forever, in time and eternity, his freedom. The voice of the director urging upon him the proud claims of the church and the mystery and power of the priestly office repeated itself idly in his memory. His soul was not there to hear and greet it, and he knew now that the exhortation he had listened to had already fallen into an idle formal tale. He would never swing the thurible before the tabernacle as priest. His destiny was to be elusive of social or religious orders. The wisdom of the priest's appeal did not touch him to the quick. He was destined to learn his own wisdom apart from others, or to learn the wisdom of others himself, wandering among the snares of the world. The snares of the world were its way of sin. He would fall. He had not yet fallen, but he would fall silently, in an instant. Not to fall was too hard. And he felt the silent lapse of his soul, as it would be at some instant to come, falling, but not yet fallen, still unfallen, but about to fall. Okay, so passage 3. Passage 3 comes from chapter 4, and here Stephen is considering joining the priesthood after living an adolescent life full of sin, turned away from God. So he was previously convinced to explore this life by another priest, but ultimately he comes to a realization that he would continue to fall into sin, and this would make him not so great of a priest. He knew that he wanted to explore the world more, especially in terms of art, and that he wouldn't be able to do so in the way he wanted had he continued to go down the path of priesthood. He was already full of a lot of guilt for what he had done when he was younger, and it essentially made him decide to turn away from the religion completely. He realized that to discover himself, he would need to leave religion, and he was at a point where he had no shame in doing so. And of course now things are looked at a little differently. For example, if you were to look at Pope Francis, he was extremely passionate about the arts and literature, but in early 20th century Ireland, Stephen was forced to choose one or the other, and ultimately he went with what he felt called to, art. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender, bare legs were delicate as a crane's, and pure save, where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her thighs, fuller and soft-hued as ivory, were bared almost to the hips, where the white fringes of her drawers were like feathering of soft white down. Her slate-blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird's, soft and slight and soft, as the breast of some dark-plumaged dove. But her long fair hair was girlish, and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty her face. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long, she suffered his gaze, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his, and bent them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot, hither and thither. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. "Heavenly God!" cried Stephen's soul, in an outburst of profane joy. He turned away from her suddenly and set off across the strand. His cheeks were aflame, his body was aglow, his limbs were trembling. On and on he strode, far out over the sands, singing wildly to the sea, crying to greet the advent of life that had cried to him. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. Her eyes had called to him, and his soul had leaped at the call. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him, in an instant of ecstasy, the gates of all the ways of error and glory, on and on and on and on. Passage 4 comes from the 4th chapter of the book, and it's so integral to the work as a whole. So his vision of the girl gazing out at the sea is symbolic of him having to find freedom in art and creativity. To him, she represented life, a life which he should be free to do what he wants and explore all that's out there for him in the world. His profane joy represents how he feels so strongly about art and discovering himself, although it's seen as wrong in the eyes of society. He has pressure on him to, maintain his faith as a Catholic and to stay in Ireland and be like a prideful nationalist, but he doesn't want to do either of those things. He wants to live his dream life as an artist. And then James Simon of Medium writes, "It is about deconstructing faith and finding meaning in life as well as identity contrary to the environment. Everything about Stephen Dedalus, about his life, should have made him a strong Irish Catholic, but he leaves it all behind, literally to be an artist who is both and neither." So again, this is just putting emphasis on the fact that he should have turned out a certain way because of his upbringing. But if anything, it made him do the opposite because he had this innate passion for art, and nothing could have stopped him from pursuing that. And this also sort of segues into the next passage, which I'll read next. April 16th. Away, away. The spell of arms and voices, the white arms of roads, their promise of close embraces, and the black arms of tall ships that stand against the moon, their tale of distant nations. They are held out to say, "We are alone, come." And the voices say with them, "We are your kinsmen." And the air is thick with their company as they call to me, their kinsmen, making ready to go, shaking the wings of their exultant and terrible youth. April 26th. Mother is putting my new second-hand clothes in order. She prays now, she says, that I may learn in my own life and away from home and friends what the heart is and what it feels. Amen. So be it. Welcome, O life, I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge from the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. April 27th. Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead. The end. The final passage of the book I chose is actually from the last chapter and is the closing words of the book. So it ends with Stephen deciding to embark on a journey outside of Ireland to discover what he's really passionate about. And in this final diary entry, this is him making a concrete decision to follow art and to an extent abandon his Irish Catholic identity. And he refers to it as the reality of experience. And that one key phrase essentially sums up everything he feels at this point in his life. Like, this is what he feels life is truly about. It's about going out and exploring what you're passionate about and not being stuck in a cycle of monotony. And he's ready to explore the unknown, ready for something new. Okay, so while all of these passages are pretty different, they're all extremely helpful in illustrating Stephen's story. They provide context for his beginning, show him mature over the years, and they give reasons as to why he decides to abandon everything he's ever known. They're all crucial to him realizing that nothing matters to him more than art and creative freedom. He craves this freedom, and he needs to be able to go out and explore. Otherwise, life has no meaning to him. Some may say it was abrupt and harsh for him to leave the country in a Catholic faith. Depends on your point of view. But ultimately, that was what he felt was the necessary thing to do. He had confidence in leaving behind his family and his present life to embark on this uncertain journey. And after reflecting on reading, it doesn't seem like it's a right decision or a wrong decision, but rather what he felt was vital to finding meaning in life.